Welcome back to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
For today's deep dive, we're taking a trip back in time to explore ancient and medieval Nepal.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and I think it really is. It's a place with such rich history, and we've gotten so many requests from our listeners to dive into this topic.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and to guide us on this journey, we're turning to a classic text,
Sweet.
Ancient and Medieval Nepal, published in 1952 by D.R. Regmi.
A foundational work.
It really is, yeah. It offers such a valuable perspective on, the early settlements,
Right.
how culture flourished, and, how power dynamics shifted in the Kathmandu Valley and the surrounding areas.
Exactly.
So before we get into the specifics, I'm curious from your perspective, what kind of sources did Regmi draw upon to kind of paint this picture of early Nepal?
Well, he uses a variety of them.
Mhm.
The traditional historical chronicles called the Vansavalis are central.
Oh, okay, the Vansavalis.
Yeah, these are really key for understanding the, kind of origin stories and the beliefs of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also digs into inscriptions, which are, more concrete evidence, but often fragmentary, especially for later periods like the Lichadi era.
Right.
But it's not just textual sources. He also looks at the art and the architecture and even social customs.
Oh, wow. So, looking at the whole picture.
Yeah, piecing together like a holistic view of life in ancient and medieval Nepal.
That's so interesting. Okay, so I guess, the mission for us in this deep dive is to try and extract, the key insights about how Nepali society and culture formed and evolved
Absolutely.
during these early times, all seen through the lens of Regmi's research.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in.
Let's do it.
Where does he begin the story?
Well, he starts with the earliest inhabitants, and traditionally speaking, that would be the Kiratas.
The Kiratas. Yeah.
They were the first to call the Kathmandu Valley home, at least according to tradition.
Now, we hear that name a lot. The Kiratas linked to early Nepali history.
Yeah, for sure.
Do these chronicles really sort of emphasize their presence, like their initial presence and how long they were there?
Absolutely. The Vansavalis are pretty consistent in portraying the Kiratas as the original, and for a significant period, the only occupants of the valley.
Wow.
And it's not just written records either. It's deeply ingrained in local oral traditions, too.
So really a foundational presence.
Yeah, you could say that.
That's fascinating. So then, when we think of, the Newars of Kathmandu and their cultural identity, it feels quite distinct.
Right.
How does Regmi kind of position their arrival, in relation to the Kiratas?
So that's where the story gets a bit more layered.
Okay.
He explores this view that the Newars were a later arrival
Okay.
compared to the Kiratas.
Makes sense.
One of the prominent theories suggests they migrated around the 6th century BC and links them to a confederacy known as the Vrigis.
The Vrigis. Now, I've heard of that, but remind me.
They were actually quite notable in ancient India. It was like this ancient republic, this confederacy. So imagine, a group with this, kind of advanced political structure for the time.
Interesting.
And the theory suggests some parallels between their systems and what we see in early newer society.
Okay, so there are some similarities.
Potentially, yeah, in their social and political structures. It's not like direct proof, but it's an interesting connection.
Right, it's a possible explanation.
Right.
That's fascinating. So the Vriji link is one possible explanation. Are there other ideas about where the New Wars might have come from?
Absolutely. Regmi also talks about potential connections to various Indo-Tibetan groups that might have migrated over time.
So a lot of movement in the region.
Yeah, and another possibility he raises is assimilation.
Oh, interesting.
So maybe later arrivals interacted and integrated with earlier inhabitants like the Kiratas over a long period.
So it's more complex than just one group replacing another?
Exactly. It's probably a mosaic, a blend of influences.
That makes sense. What about the Nuwari language itself? Does that give us any clues about these origins and interactions?
It does. Linguistically, Nuwari has a Tibeto-Burman foundation,
Okay.
which suggests connections to those language families.
Okay.
But then it also has a significant amount of Sanskrit influence.
Really?
Yeah. So this blend kind of points to a long history of exchange and interaction with groups who spoke Indo-Aryan languages.
That's fascinating. It reflects that kind of, crossroads where Nepal sits.
Absolutely. Like a cultural and linguistic crossroads.
So let's shift gears a little bit from origins to early life in the valley.
Okay.
Regardless of when specific groups arrived, what does Regmi tell us about their culture and how they lived?
Well, his account really emphasizes that early culture was primarily agricultural.
Which makes sense. Fertile land.
Right. The Kathmandu Valley is known for that.
Yeah.
Interestingly, though, some observations suggest that in the very earliest period, they might not have been using bullock-driven plows.
Oh, really?
So it points to a more manual approach to farming.
Wow, so just hand tools and human labor.
Yeah, potentially.
Hmm.
Well, at least in those initial stages.
I wonder what that means for the scale of agriculture.
Right. It probably meant smaller scale cultivation, maybe more intensive use of hand tools.
Interesting.
And it raises questions about surplus and how that impacted societal development.
Right, if you're not producing as much surplus, it changes things.
Exactly.
Now, apart from farming, what other aspects of early culture does Regmi highlight?
Well, even in these early times, there's evidence of some pretty advanced craftsmanship.
Oh, really?
He notes the development of pottery, wood carving, and metalwork.
Wow.
So you can see a certain level of specialization
Right, people honing their crafts.
and artistic skill even in those early communities.
I mean, that makes sense given what we know about the later artistic traditions of the Kathmandu Valley.
It's like seeing those early seeds being planted.
Exactly. Now, what about their spiritual beliefs and practices?
Ah, that's a fascinating aspect. The religious landscape, particularly how it developed among the Newars, is characterized by this remarkable syncretism.
Syncretism.
Yeah, it's like a harmonious blending of Buddhism and Hinduism.
Okay, so not one replacing the other, but kind of coexisting?
Exactly. They coexisted and influenced each other, often sharing deities and even temples.
So you could go to one temple and see elements of both.
Sometimes, yeah. It was a very fluid and integrated religious culture.
That's so interesting. How did that play out in their practices?
Well, one key thing was this deep reverence for tantric practices,
Okay,
which permeated both Buddhist and Hindu traditions in the valley.
interesting.
And festivals were huge.
Of course, festivals are still a big part of life there.
Absolutely. They were central to their religious and social life and often showcased this blend of Buddhist and Hindu elements.
It's such a vibrant picture.
It really is very community-oriented.
Now let's talk about art and architecture,
Right.
because when we think of Nepal, that's one of the first things that comes to mind.
Definitely.
What does Regmi emphasize in these excerpts about that aspect?
Well, this unique artistic and architectural heritage is a major theme in his work.
Okay.
He specifically points to the pagoda style as a distinctive Nepali contribution.
Yeah, the pagoda style.
Yes, and what's really interesting is that this form wasn't just confined to Nepal. It actually had a huge influence on the architecture of Tibet and even China.
Really? So those iconic tiered roofs we associate with temples across Asia,
They might have roots right here in Nepal, according to Regmi.
that's a powerful legacy.
Mm.
What are some of the defining characteristics of these Nepali temples?
Well, the tiered roofs, of course, are very prominent.
Okay.
And then you have these incredibly intricate wood carvings,
Oh, wow.
which are just a hallmark of Nepali artistry.
Yeah.
And they mainly use brick and wood as the primary materials, often with gilded copper for decoration.
Oh, wow. So those gilded details must have been really striking.
Absolutely. They would have added a real sense of splendor.
Are there any specific early structures that Regmi points to as, really significant examples?
Yes, he mentioned Swayambhunath and Bada as early and incredibly important examples of Buddhist architecture in the valley.
Oh, yeah. Those are iconic.
Right. And he highlights their symbolic importance and how they've endured as landmarks.
There's still pilgrimage sites today.
Absolutely.
So beyond these religious structures, what other forms of art were prevalent during those times?
Well, Regmi talks about sculpture, which was mainly in stone and metal,
Okay.
and often depicting Hindu deities like Vishnu and Shiva.
So again, reflecting that religious syncretism.
Exactly.
Fascinating. What else?
Painting was also practiced a lot in the form of murals and manuscript covers,
Beautiful.
and it shows influences from both Indian and Tibetan artistic traditions.
It sounds like a real melting pot of styles.
It really was. A lot of cross-cultural exchange.
I love that. And he also mentioned something about metal casting.
Yes, he highlights the skill of Nepali artists in metal casting,
Okay.
even mentioning a renowned figure, Araniko, whose work actually reached Indonesia.
Wow. All the way to Indonesia.
Yeah. Imagine the reach of Nepali craftsmanship.
That's incredible. Okay, so let's turn our attention now to how society and power were structured,
Okay.
during these ancient and medieval times. How did political organization take shape?
Well, Regmi outlines the early political structures, starting with the rule of the curatas, as we discussed earlier.
Okay.
And he notes that eventually their rule declined, although the details of that transition aren't always clear.
Right, so a shift in power.
Exactly.
So what came after the Kurata period in terms of political organization?
The Licchavi period is presented as a really significant era.
Okay, the Licchavis.
Yes, and Regmi points to the influence of the Gupta Empire of India.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you see it in their inscriptions and administrative practices,
Okay.
but establishing a precise Lichavi lineage and timeline is tricky.
Okay.
There are different interpretations offered by scholars like Kirkpatrick, Wright, and Levi,
I see.
often based on different interpretations of the evidence.
So piecing together a precise history is challenging.
It is, but it's also part of what makes it so fascinating.
Absolutely. What about social developments during that time?
Well, one important development was the emergence of feudalism.
Okay, feudalism. So a move towards, more decentralized power.
Right, characterized by the rise of the Samantas, who were basically local chiefs.
Okay, so local leaders gaining more power.
Yeah, wielding a lot of authority and influence in their areas.
Interesting. How was society structured more broadly among the Nuars?
Well, Regmi describes a complex caste system among the Nuars, which was influenced by both Buddhist and Hindu traditions.
Okay, so this blend again?
Exactly, it's everywhere.
Yeah,
And this caste system involved occupational divisions,
of course.
with certain groups holding a higher social standing.
So your occupation determined your place in society.
To a large extent, yes.
But it's interesting that, traders and artisans had a good amount of respect.
That is interesting. It suggests that the economic engine of society was highly valued.
That's a good point. Now, as we move into the medieval period, what are the key characteristics according to Regmi?
Okay, so the medieval period begins with the rise of the Thakuri dynasty, followed by a longer period of Malala rule.
Okay, the Thakurtis and then the Mallas?
Right. And he introduces this concept of de facto rule, especially during the later Malala period.
What does that mean?
Well, the actual power resided with the prime ministers rather than the kings.
Oh, so the kings were more figureheads.
In a sense,
Yeah, it happens a lot throughout history.
it does. Power dynamics can be complex.
So what about social conditions during that time?
Well, the caste system remained a prominent feature.
Okay.
Religious festivals continue to be incredibly important.
As they are today.
Exactly. And tantricism continued to be a strong influence.
Really?
Yeah, both religiously and socially.
So a lot of continuity from earlier periods.
Definitely. Some things endured even as others changed.
Now what about their autonomy? What were the main activities?
Agriculture remained the foundation, of course,
Okay.
but trade really flourished.
Oh, interesting.
Nepal's location meant it controlled key trade routes between Tibet and India,
Right.
and that brought a lot of economic prosperity.
So they were like a middleman.
In a sense, yeah,
Mm.
a vital link. And Regmi also highlights the development of early coinage in Nepal,
Oh.
which played a crucial role in facilitating all this trade.
So that's a big step in economic development.
Absolutely. It shows a level of sophistication.
Now, were there any major disruptions during this long period, invasions or times of instability?
Yes, Regmi does mention periods of instability and instances of invasions.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, he notes Muslim incursions and their impact on the political landscape.
So they weren't completely isolated.
No place ever truly is.
Right. External forces always play a role.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this dive into Regmi's work, what are the biggest takeaways about ancient and medieval Nepal?
Well, we see this fascinating evolution from early settlements, likely with the Kiratas,
Right.
to the emergence of the Nuars and their unique cultural synthesis in the Kathmandu Valley.
Yes.
This era saw a flourishing of art and architecture with the development of that influential pagoda style.
Yes, such a beautiful style.
And religiously, this distinctive blend of Buddhism and Hinduism emerged deeply influenced by tantric practices.
It's really a unique religious landscape.
It is.
And politically, we see power structures shifting from early rulers to the Lichavis with Gupta influences and later to the Thakuri and Malla dynasties. And of course, the caste system shaping social hierarchies.
Absolutely, a complex interplay of social and political forces.
It's clear, though, that the historical record isn't always straightforward.
That's true. Regmi emphasizes the challenges of establishing a precise chronology for early Nepal.
Right, because you have chronicles that blend fact and legend.
Exactly, and you have fragmented inscriptions and different interpretations of cultural artifacts.
And different scholars coming to different
It
conclusions.
was all part of the puzzle.
But even with these historical puzzles, it's clear this period laid the foundation for the Nepal we know today.
Absolutely. The legacy of that ancient and medieval era is visible in Nepali culture, its art, and its social structures.
Well, this has been such an enlightening journey through ancient and medieval Nepal. Guided by Regmi's insights, it's incredible to see the depth and complexity of history in this region.
It truly is, and it makes you wonder, What aspects of this deep dive have particularly resonated with our listeners?
Yeah, what questions might they have now about this historical period?
Maybe even inspiring them to delve deeper on their own.
That's a great point. Always keep that curiosity alive.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been my pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring.